Hello, my name is James Underhill. I'm from the Rouen Ethnolinguistics project, and I'm here at Australia National University with Anna Wierzbicka. Anna, you set up the natural semantics meta-language with Cliff Goddard a couple of decades ago now, and you have a fairly critical relationship with the idea of vagueness and family resemblances. This has become a very popular notion, is one that I've also worked with myself, but you seem to be not a little hostile to this, but very critical of this idea of conceptual vagueness. It's been promoted by Roche and adopted by cognitive linguists by George Lakoff. Where do you see a problem with this idea of vagueness?
Well, I've written a lot about it, examining particular examples. I think vagueness, like polysemy, is a fact of life. The question is how to capture vague concepts with precision, because vague concepts they are concepts. So I have a paper, one in particular, on how different ways of capturing vagueness in words, how they differ from one another. So, for example, more or less, or largely, or fairly. I mean, they have different meanings, and you can identify the meanings with great precision, showing that vagueness is embedded in different ways in these different words. So I have no problem with vagueness as long as the linguistic description of vague concepts doesn't become vague, which it usually does.
Okay.
But I do have a problem with the concept of family resemblances. Well, I'm a great admirer of Wittgenstein, like so many other people, and he has wonderful insights into language. But I think he was wrong on the subject of family resemblances, and he was, which I've illustrated in various publications using his own example, game. It's such an interesting example because when Wittgenstein speaks about the different games, how you can't identify what they have in common, he is actually thinking, I think, as I've tried to show, in terms of the German word Spiel, which has different boundaries. So what he says about English game is just not correct, empirically. Yeah, he's really thinking about Spiel, but he assumes that they mean the same. So his own example shows that game and Spiel draw boundaries differently. It's not a family resemblance. You can give a very precise list of meanings for game, which will overlap with the list of meanings for Spiel, and identify each of them with great precision. So I think the way linguists, many linguists love the concept of family resemblance because it allows them not to go to the trouble of identifying meanings with any precision. It makes everything so easy. You come up with a definition which doesn't fit the range of use. I say, well, that's because of family resemblance. I think that's very lazy semantics.
Okay, so you wouldn't have a problem with the fact that a child will start thinking of a book, then understand a magazine, or generally the way the child will move from the thing on the table to the book on the table to the magazine to the booklet. You wouldn't have a problem with that kind of various levels of precision that's part of language. It's a question of methodology.
No, I think the child moves through a series of different meanings. It's extremely interesting to show how the meaning changes for the child, but you can identify the meaning at each stage if you have the primes.
Okay, let's talk about, because I know that you spend a lot of time with your grandchildren. Do you observe that in your grandchildren, the way they move towards increasing levels of precision?
No, I wouldn't call it increasing level of precision. I think they are very precise in what they mean.
Okay.
Just the meanings are different.
Okay, that's interesting.
And we have the tools to identify their concepts, and then the new concepts, and then the adult concepts, and so on.
Okay, I understand. Okay then, for in terms of universals, we can't help thinking of Chomsky and the idea of universal grammar, but this seems very, very different from your approaches to universals. Could you make a distinction between what you're doing in the natural semantics meta-language and what Chomsky was trying to do with this idea of universal grammar?
Well, we try to posit universal grammar on an empirical basis by comparing grammars of different languages and establishing what they have in common, whereas that was not Chomsky's approach. His idea was, I don't know, it was what it was based on, well, presumably maybe on English, but it was not tested against what happens in many different languages. From Chomsky's point of view, well, he often said that the deep grammar is essentially the same without looking at languages.
Yes, he was one of his famous books was Language and Thought. I suppose from the natural semantics meta-language, you would have a problem with thinking of language and thought as universals. They're English
it's just
words.
so vague. I really don't know. No, to speak and to think, these are universal human concepts.
Okay,
So
to speak and to think.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, I think
But
so.
not language. Language
And,
would take
yeah,
us
but
into
no, language is a very language-specific concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay then, moving on to work that seems to run parallel to, but not necessarily to coincide with. We have the work of Levinson and Wilkins, who've worked on spatial thinking. I know you've worked a lot on spatial thinking. It is one of the aspects of the way you interpret prepositions and spatial concepts of inside and outside is personally for me one of the most fascinating parts of your work. I know that they're working on these questions. Is there any compatibility between psycholinguistics and NSM in your opinion?
Oh, I think that their work is entirely compatible with ours. What interests us in this area, like in any other areas, is to identify first the concepts that we can work with, the concepts which we find in all languages. I don't think they've ever asked such a question, and we find that you have above and below. For example, in our languages, far and near, inside, but not outside.
Inside, why
Well,
is
because
that
outside means not inside.
Okay, so it's a
you know,
negation of the...
So it's a combination of two primes, not and not inside.
So you're not working, this is one of the interesting things that I had difficulty coming to terms with. You're not thinking in terms of oppositions as primes, you're thinking of one prime defining another, outside being outsiders and outside being defined in terms of inside and insiders, I suppose.
Well, there is no general principle, we just look and see. So for example, big and small are both primes.
Okay.
And many people would like to define one in terms of the other,
Okay.
but it doesn't work. Because if you say that something is very small, then you can't define it in terms of big, and vice versa.
This is one of the fascinating, one of the very challenging things about natural semantics meta-language, that you're not thinking in terms of abstract nouns, which is going to be the usual conditioning form. If we look from the categories, we can talk about the way that Aristotle has his categories that are going to be transformed by Kant's categories, and Humboldt's going to be really relying quite seriously on those categories. But you're not thinking in terms of these universality or individuality, or you're not thinking in terms of size. You're thinking of big, small,
absolutely,
inside, or to what degree outside can be brought back to a concept of inside.
Most languages don't have abstract nouns. So, but you can say in any language this is big or this is small, but you cannot ask what size is it. Okay,
so let's get into one of the moral and sort of very important, crucial questions at the moment. For a long time, or through the 19th century when we're working through linguistic anthropology, we're going to be thinking about languages advanced or primitive language. This is not really an idea that's coming from Herder or from Humboldt. The 18th century is very much more advanced, very much closer to us than we are today, but we've come through 100 years of thinking in terms of abstract noun as more progressive, more developed. You seem to be skeptical about that, and you seem to be skeptical about the whole idea of language and thought needing these abstract nouns, which is going to be one of the...
Well, abstract nouns are very needed in certain cultures. It's for certain types of discourse, and this is linked with literacy too, I think. So if you want to talk about very complex subjects quickly, as people do in English, they often use abstract nouns. But you know, the use of those abstract nouns has been criticized within the Anglo tradition as well. Jeremy Bentham and his series of fictions is a wonderful book here, which we analyze, Cliff and I, in our book, Words and Meanings, because the meaning of those abstract nouns is usually not defined.
Okay.
So this leads to a lot of confusion, and people don't understand what you are saying, but it's not obvious that you don't understand each other. But once you analyze everything in terms of very clear and simple concepts like big and small, then you make your meaning clear, and the differences also become clear, and you can talk, and you have these words in all languages.
It's very interesting what you say, that it's not clear that we don't understand what we mean.
Right.
This is one of the problems I had when I was
Yeah.
translating rhythm. Many people in French and in English were convinced that the rhythm of Shakespeare was wonderful. One was speaking about intonation, one was speaking about accentuation, one was speaking about metrics, and one was speaking about the specific way that Shakespeare plays with it. So my problem was that not that people didn't understand. That as long as there was confusion and controversy, then there was argument. But that argument was based on something solid. A lot of the time, we're speaking in these very vague terms where we think we agree, and this is really a very fundamental level of thinking about language. That seems to me really one of the things that you're trying to thrash out.
That's right. It seems to me, this may seem paradoxical, that when you use very simple words like big and small, or do and happen, you can really achieve accuracy, which you cannot achieve with abstract nouns.
That's interesting. Okay, to come back to this idea of space then, I mean, spatial language is fundamental for the primes in, or inside, in, above, below. What do you think natural semantics contributes to this idea of spatial thinking? What do you think we can take from that?
You mentioned Levinson and his school. The idea which has special importance for them is the idea of human body. To what extent human body gives us a reference point for thinking about space. And they start with Immanuel Kant's idea that human body is a very important point of orientation for all humans. And Levinson seems to think that he discovered that Kant was wrong and Levinson was right, that human body is not a universal point of reference. Well, there's something to it, because people like Levinson discovered that in some languages, human body the environment plays a greater role than just the human body, especially, for example, in Australian languages, but also in Celtal, in Mayan languages, and so on. In particular, the idea of on the right and on the left, which plays a very important role in European languages, doesn't seem to play much of a role in Celtal or in Aboriginal languages. So he somehow seems to have come to the conclusion that Kant was wrong. Well, I think that's a lot of exaggeration. I think that Kant was essentially right, but he didn't realize that everybody on Earth think about space as much in terms of on the right and on the left as, for example, Europeans do. But we looked into it specifically. The idea that the body gives you some kind of reference point is based on the assumption that you can think about the sky above and the ground below, and things in front of me and something at the back of me, and then also on one side and on the other side. So, do languages like Celtal, for example, have the concept on one side? And I think, looking at the data shown by Levinson himself and Penny Brown, his wife, and so on, you actually can say in those languages on the one side, on the side where my right hand is, because they do have a word for right hand. So on the side of me where my right hand is, you can say. But they usually don't talk like this, because people usually talk in terms of reference points, like where the mountain is or where the river is. So that's fine. So there are different cultural elaborations, especially in the case of side. But the concept on one side is there. So the basic universal concepts of space, according to our research, are the same everywhere, but they are not made use of to the same extent in different languages.
That's fascinating, because I think it's what Levinson's trying to do, and this kind of provocation there. He's trying to work with this opposition that's been a long-term opposition between Leibniz's idea of relative space and Kant's idea of absolute space. But he doesn't seem to be a close reader of Kant, and he doesn't seem to be that interested in the way that Kant is thinking of the world in terms of the individual. Your way of looking at space is various ways of organizing it within the body and within the community seems to be much more empirical. One of the things about Levinson's work that I'm a little uncomfortable with is that he sees language as a window into thinking. And this really seems to me a very much an Anglo tradition of using other languages as ways of getting into the ways of thinking. Is it not fair to say that natural semantics method wants to get into the languages themselves and then to understand, rather than seeing them as a means to an end?
I don't know. I don't think one excludes the other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, James.